that is designed to sort of titillate and in some cases to frighten.
Is it necessary?
They show pictures of blacks frequently. And once in a while, the blacks get a night off and they show Latinos.
Go, Mike. Go!
Is it important?
There's a lot of anger among any number of viewers who say you're just not reflecting my neighborhood, my city.
Everyone in the news business, including ABC and its affiliates, is now immersed in a kind of a tabloid culture that celebrates sex and violence and weird crimes.
A minister was murdered outside his Brooklyn church.
Standing by live with the news van with the very latest on this
And when
story.
it was over, a store clerk lay dead. It happened around 2:30.
This is an ABC News special. Viewpoint, crime, violence, and TV news. Now reporting from ABC News in Washington, Ted Koppel.
Good evening and welcome to our ABC News studios in Washington. I'll be talking a little bit more about our guests here in just a moment. It is probably a good thing that you will rarely, if ever, find large mirrors hanging from the walls of a newsroom. I'm not altogether sure that I would like to catch a glimpse of myself when word of some disaster reaches us. The sudden pumping of adrenaline that goes with the arrival of a big be a useful part of journalism, but it's not terribly attractive. You've heard the expression, one man's meat is another man's poison. Unfortunately, in our line of work, everybody else's poison tends to be our meat. Because the consequences of violence and crime are so often graphic and more or less self-explanatory, they provide easy and therefore frequent targets for television news. I fear that if several of you showed up in my driveway to gauge my reaction to the slaughter of my wife on a commuter train or the rape of my daughter in some alley, I might lose some of my enthusiasm for the First Amendment. But those are the kinds of issues that we are here to talk about tonight, and we have some remarkable resources at our disposal. Everyone whose name you see moving past you on the screen right now is either here in the studio with us or available to us by satellite. It is possible that you will not hear from everyone, but as we move through a variety of subjects related to crime and violence on TV news, each of these people has something useful to say, either in criticism or rebuttal. We'll get to as many of them as we can. We begin, though, with the subject of pictures and policy. Here's Jeff Greenfield.
A picture is worth 1,000 words. That shop-worn cliche also encompasses a central truth. On television, it's the image, the picture, that rivets our attention, that tells us what no other medium ever has. Little more than a year ago, these images compelled us to act. They were pictures from a land with which few Americans had ties of kinship, a land of no current strategic interest. A few months later, we saw these pictures, the bodies of American soldiers killed in a firefight, dragged through the streets by a mob. These pictures created a firestorm of protest against the media. Was it really necessary, critics asked, to show such grisly images of young Americans who died serving their country? Did young children have to be exposed to such disturbing images? But the pictures also created a political firestorm with loud demands that America leave Somalia immediately. Was most of Somalia at peace? Were hundreds of thousands of lives saved because of U.S. intervention? In the face of these pictures, those questions were drowned out.
I think the problem has always been for all of us that we have to put news in context, that no story, no picture can be conveyed to the public in isolation, that outside the range of the camera, something else might be going on that would really put the story or the pictures into context.
This dilemma has been with us throughout the TV age. Take this famous film of the street corner execution of a Viet Cong fighter in 1968. Did it fairly symbolize the brutality of the war in Vietnam? Or did it oversimplify the debate? The flight of American hostages in Iran in 1979 was incredibly dramatic footage. Did it capture a key foreign policy issue? Or did the pictures force the Carter White House to become obsessed with the hostages? When Americans saw the television images of the destroyed Marine barracks in Beirut in 1983, did that force the Reagan administration to withdraw American troops from Lebanon? The idea of a president formulating foreign policy based on fleeting images is, to put it mildly, unsettling. It's even more unsettling when we consider that sometimes we don't know what these dramatic pictures may be telling us. For instance, we've been witnessing horror in Bosnia for well over a year. We've seen pictures of unfathomable suffering. But what message do these pictures deliver? Are these pictures of another Holocaust demanding our involvement? Or are they pictures of another Vietnam demanding our restraint? And if the message is this confusing, can we really ask a news organization to withhold such pictures from the public because of their power to overwhelm us?
Larry Rivers of the VFW, I know that you, like all Americans, were horrified by those pictures of the dead ranger in particular being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, but you felt we shouldn't have shown them. Why?
Ted, there's not any question that we should not, first of all, set policy based on these pictures. My concern was for the young men and women that we asked to live and die carrying out this policy. My concern is that where is the compassion we have always shown to them and their families? It seems to me, at the very least, a mother or a wife or a daughter should not have to learn about the loved one on CNN or ABC or any other news program. We've always shown a certain amount of respect for those that give their life. It seems to me that we ought to follow through as it pertains to those graphic kinds of pictures.
Let me just follow up with you to this degree. Had the various news organizations that showed that picture waited half a day or a day until they could be sure that the Pentagon had notified the family, would you still have objected?
Well, I don't think those pictures belong to all posterity simply because you've died for your country that somebody else ought to make that decision. It seems to me the very least that we could do is ask the wife or the mother, let them see those pictures and ask for permission to use them. It doesn't seem to me that we have a right to ask young men and women to bleed and die and also tell them that their death can be used in any way some newsman may see fit.
If that is true, then shouldn't every victim of every crime or every action that takes place overseas not be shown in any form until the families approve of it? And if so, what would happen to the news coverage of those events? And how does a free society, which judges in large measure on the basis of what it reads in the newspapers and sees on television, how does it make those judgments?
Ted, I'd make a very restrictive argument because I think we have to make exceptions for young men and women we're asking to die in defense of our country and carrying out our foreign policy. Perhaps we can debate all of those other issues, but it seems crystal clear to me that when we're talking about the armed forces, men and women that we ask to do violent things because war itself is violence, we don't educate the American people, it seems to me, that war is violent simply by showing dead soldiers being dragged through the streets. We know that. We have an armed forces simply to kill people and to be killed in carrying out our foreign policy. So it doesn't add to me the debate, it seems, to personalize it one-on-one by showing one dead soldier being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu.
All right, you've raised a number of provocative issues. When you come back, we'll also be joined by George Stephanopoulos, who's a senior advisor to President Clinton, to discuss the issue of the degree to which that particular picture may have affected U.S. foreign policy. Back in a moment.
Viewpoint, crime, violence, and TV news is brought to you by Mercedes-Benz. This ABC News special will continue in a moment.
1993, we designed a new car.
We have been doing these Viewpoint programs for well over a decade now as an opportunity for our critics to tell us what they think we are doing wrong. George Stephanopoulos, in this instance, do you think that those pictures, particularly of the ranger being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, did that put an unfair pressure on the government, most particularly on President Clinton, to reach a decision on getting out of Somalia?
I don't know about unfair, but I think inappropriate. Because as you point out, what happens when a picture that powerful, even if incomplete, is presented on television, the only governing virtue is decisiveness. The question is, what are you going to do? It doesn't really matter what the answer is just do something. I mean, CNN, Bernie Shaw will get on and he'll go live to Wolf Blitzer on the lawn of the White House, and they'll cover every official riding in for the meeting with the president. They'll go back to the Hill, and everybody's going to start the drumbeat. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? What are you going to do?
I can understand that that makes you uncomfortable, but what are we going to do? What are you suggesting that we do?
I think that the only answer is for probably more pictures, not fewer. Jeff brought it up in his first piece. What that picture didn't tell is that most of the Rangers actually were heroes in a largely successful firefight. It didn't show that most of the people in Somalia were being fed, and that the policy was working to a degree. The casualties were horrible, tragic, but the policy was moving in the right direction and now continues to, we hope. And it's just we need more pictures, more text.
Was it a function, Bernie, of not enough pictures, or just that that particular picture was so dramatic, so powerful, so horrifying that it overshadowed all the others?
I think we forget the thousands and thousands of pictures that were shown, not only American people, but the world. All the news media over there did stories about a very courageous and sensitive people and a leadership in Washington deciding to go over and help starving people. But something went awry with the policy. Instead of feeding people, a decision was made to hunt down a particular leader. And that changed the dynamics over there. And we had every right and every reason to report what was happening over there in the name of the American people. And certainly to show that an American soldier was being dragged through the streets, a member of a unit that had gone over there originally to feed people. Something had gone awry.
Tom Brokaw out there in Los Angeles, you heard what Larry Rivers had to say before. He didn't think we should, not only did he feel that we should not have used that picture, but indeed that we should not be using pictures at all of young American men and women who go overseas to fight and perhaps die. Your response?
Well, he knows firsthand the horrors of war, obviously, Ted, and I know that he wants to protect the families, but unfortunately, the harsh reality is that young men and women in the armed services are the very embodiment, for better or for worse, of our national policy, and they become an extension of that debate wherever they go and whatever happens to them, and that's what happened in this case. So I think it's impossible for us not to show not only their triumphs, but also when, unfortunately, they get caught up in the kind of tragedies that we saw there in Somalia. As for Mr. Stephanopoulos, I would also say that all immediate past presidents and all future presidents will be making decisions in this kind of an electronic universe, and they're going to have to come to grips with that. I think part of the problem is, Ted, that the cycle now is so dense and so unending that you don't just see those pictures once for 30 seconds on CNN, you see them all day long, 24 hours a day, on a wide variety of channels.
Before we close out on this segment for a moment, and it's you I'm coming back to, Mr. Rivers, the one question that I think may be even more difficult for a newsman to answer than why did you show it would be if later on you were to come back to us and say, for God's sakes, why didn't you show it? Why didn't we know what was going on? Can you imagine the American public coming back to us and saying we had no idea how horrible it was? Why didn't you let us know?
Well, Ted, as I said before, I don't think when you die in combat that suddenly you belong to all posterity and become something that belongs to the American people. The question that I would ask, what do these journalists feel is their obligation to individual soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines that are killed in battle and mutilated in battle? Don't they feel some responsibility to the memory of that person, to the family of that person? Because this is not some broad policy thing. This is an individual that has people that love them and care about them and would like to see them come home. So what sort of responsibility does the news media feel they have to those individuals? Do they think that's overshadowed by some grander purpose?
I saw it over your shoulder. Tom Brokaw was nodding sympathetically. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, I think it is a delicate balance, Ted, and we are constantly striving to do that. You'll remember that during the Persian Gulf War, however, that we couldn't show the bodies coming home at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware when they come back in the flag-draped coffins. And we obviously don't want to intrude on the grief of families, but at the same time, I think that the wider public does have to know about the cost of war and about the terrible pain that many families feel and that the ultimate sacrifice that those young men and women make when they die in combat.
We may very well come back to this subject a little bit later in the program, but there are a lot of different areas that we want to cover. When we come back, we'll begin to take up the issue of crime and race.
blacks control. The first electric shave.
And the subject now is crime, race, and the perceptions and misperceptions created by television news. Here once again is ABC's Jeff Greenfield.
Here are some unpleasant facts from the FBI. Last year, more than 60% of all robbery arrests, more than half of all murder and manslaughter arrests were of blacks, who make up only 12% of the population. So if the televised images of crime that we see feature black faces, isn't that simply a reflection of reality? Critics say it's not that simple.
Don't move. Don't move.
When police released the security camera tape of a Washington, D.C. jewelry store robbery and shooting, they were hoping someone in the viewing audience might identify the criminals. The image, black perpetrators, Asian victim, was what happened that day. But what does it mean when night after night, the images of criminal suspects, of drug dealers, of street violence are so often that of young black men? Novelist Ishmael Reed says the message is as clear as it is misleading.
Television seizes upon those rare instances of interracial violence and projects that upon the whole nation as being the whole thing and the whole story. And what happens is, as a result, is that whites are afraid of so-called black underclass criminals when they have the least to be afraid.
There's no doubt that crimes by one race against another, as with the near murder of a professional white woman jogger in Central Park, get enormous headlines. But in fairness, so do stories about white violence against blacks, whether by New York gangs or by Los Angeles police. What worries critics is that the constant imagery of young black men as criminals or drug users tells a misleading, dangerous story.
I think you should also be reporting the fact that there is a lot of recreational drug use among whites, but that is probably taking place in a private home or in an office building, a high-rise office building someplace, and the police don't raid those buildings.
You don't see very much on television middle-class blacks, people who get up and go to work every day, people who are working hard and support their families. That tends to get squeezed out of the news equation.
And that, worry the critics, is the real issue. The one-dimensional portrayal of black inner-city America as a crime story and nothing else. That's the story one-time local news reporter and anchor Lillian Dunlop wishes she'd covered more.
I think that I would spend more time covering stories that had to do with how groups actually move, what can be done, for example, for some of the minority groups in Indianapolis with regard to, for example, buying a house or getting something done that has to do with finances and money.
But who will commit the time and money needed to do those stories when the wailing sirens and the bleeding bodies and the handcuffed suspects are so much easier to find?
Ishmael Reed, give us a capsule account, if you will, of how you would change, modify, alter, improve television news, local network, insofar as it deals with the issue of crime and race.
Well, I cover these issues in my new book, Airing Dirty Laundry. And the thesis of this book is that while the warts and the dirty laundry of black America is exhibited every night on television, that of white America is seldom seen. I don't know whether this is white nationalism in the media, where whites bond with whites. For example, you showed the Reginald Denning footage there of blacks assaulting this truck driver. But forgotten during that riot was that 50 Latinos and African American people were killed. There was no investigation, I guess, on how they met their deaths, whether they were murdered by each other, whether they were murdered by mobs, whether they were murdered by the National Guard. So the impression comes across that white life is more important to the media than black life.
And so how would you improve it?
I would like to see all the pathologies of the different groups and races and ethnic groups in the society aired as much as the pathologies of so-called African American.
And if indeed the statistics of black crime, black against black,
misleading. Those statistics are misleading.
Inaccurate or misleading?
Every serious journal that you will read, which incidentally talks about media myths, will say that black people don't commit more crime; they get arrested more. Now, Senator Herb Kohl, who's one of the most one of the few politicians in this country who's capable of having a rational conversation about crime, says in a study which was released by his Juvenile Justice Committee that the average black person, the black kid, we're talking about teenagers across the board. These are the people who are in trouble. These are the people committing crimes. But the average teenager or black teenager is 5 times as likely to be arrested for committing the same crime as a white teenager. Now, we have an Irish-American sheriff in San Francisco County named Hennessy, Sheriff Hennessy. He said that black people, black teenagers are disproportionately occupants of jail or incarcerated disproportionately because they get arrested for crimes that if a white teenager committed these crimes, they would be considered a prank.
Okay, hold that thought. We have a black chief of police here in Washington, and he's joined us here this evening. We'll get his thoughts in just a moment.
Special Viewpoint, crime, violence, and TV news continues. Once again, Ted Koppel.
Fred Thomas is the chief of police here in Washington, D.C. Let's start with the factual charge that was made by Ishmael Reed a moment ago, namely that young black men are picked up more frequently than young white men who might be committing the same crime. True or untrue, in your opinion?
Well, in speaking in terms of Washington, it's true in Washington simply because we have more African-American residents than we do non-African Americans. But I think we would find more African Americans incarcerated for a number of reasons. One, when you have African American who's arrested and goes into the criminal justice system, that person will be defended by a public defender who may have a caseload of 10 or 12 cases. A non-African American may come into the system and be represented by a private attorney who can then get postponement, probation, and other kinds of things. So when you start looking at the levels of incarceration, you probably will find more African Americans incarcerated. In the city of Washington, though, I would say that as we target the violence, we find that the violence is concentrated in and around public housing. Unfortunately, most of the residents of public housing are African Americans, so therefore they're going to get arrested in disproportionate to the total population and incarcerated.
Now, Chief Thomas, if you would inject for us now the issue of television coverage. Focus, if you will, on local television coverage here in Washington. To what degree do you think it helps or exacerbates the problem?
I think to a great extent it exacerbates the problem in this regard, that I think is appropriate when a crime has occurred, the bodies are on the street, it's appropriate to cover that. But then in subsequent stories, it is not appropriate to then show a body lying in a pool of blood just to emphasize that a crime has occurred some weeks later. And that happened just a couple of weeks ago. We had a shooting where a young man was shot in the back, TV camera panned in, he's lying in a pool of blood. A week later, there was a follow-up concerning the arrest. Well, the camera went back and showed the body on the street. That reinforces in the public mind that the level of violence is going. And the victims in the city here are black. So when the general population sees that, they then get the impression that all blacks are involved in violent crime, and Washington is a violent city.
Sitting down there in Miami is my old friend Ann Bishop. Ann, tell me what the 2 or 3 lead stories were in your newscast tonight.
Well, it's very interesting. Our lead story was actually a home invasion, but the victims, Ted, it was a black family. And a very young black man was shot and killed trying to defend his mother from the people who had broken into his home. But also kind of an interesting fact tonight, we had a story about a number of young, well, not young, middle-aged, actually, black civic and business leaders who made it their point to go to a school and meet young people. They had to actually go through a corridor, these students did, to meet these people and find out what their jobs were and to be encouraged to stay in school and get their education. They weren't athletes or entertainers. They weren't celebrities. They were just businessmen, black businessmen in this community. And this also, as you must know, is a very difficult community because we have such a large Hispanic population, an Afro-American population, a Haitian population. There's a lot of racial tension here. And although I'm certainly proud of the job that we do, and there's a lot of violence that we show on television, we're not doing as well, but we're trying very hard to prevent the positive stories too.
Jeff Wald, you direct a news organization. Talk for a moment just about the entertainment value, and I realize that's an inflammatory term to use when we're talking about issues like violence in the streets where people are dying or being badly injured. But talk about the entertainment value of these stories and also how easy they are to cover relative to perhaps more benign stories that might take a little more work.
Well, they are easy to cover. We have made a concerted effort at our particular organization to put together what we call an enterprise story every night. We started out doing 2 of them a night. It became very difficult. We have a unit, it's about $1 million a year budget, just to do more positive stories in the community. And that is something that I think is very important. We've been inundated with so much crime and so many terrible things happening that we regurgitate that material every night, and we really need to get to the root causes and talk about those root causes. So I think that's probably what's really wrong with what I see on TV.
I'm just looking here at my seating chart. Eric Braun, I want to talk to you for a moment about what sells. You are from the Magada, the Frank Magada organization. Maybe you would just tell our audience what it is that your organization does so they understand the interaction here.
Ted, the simplest definition would be that we are the conduit for viewers' opinions as reflected in our survey data, which we collect primarily back to you as journalists and producers and broadcasters. We tell you what the viewers at the other end of the pipe are thinking about the journalism you present.
And what are the viewers telling you about
violence?
Well,
I would very quickly say that, by and large, the majority of Americans feel that the imagery on television has grown too graphically violent. They are reacting negatively. Balancing that, though, 3/4 of American television news viewers tell us that it is the media's responsibility to continue to report aggressively on violent crime.
Let me ask you what may be a tough question to answer, but if it is, I mean, if American viewers are getting tired of it, most American broadcasters are not self-destructive, at least not economically. Why then do you think that there is still so much coverage of crime if folks are not watching it?
I think, Ted, that it is, as Jeff said, it's operationally so very easy to pick up those images. It's easy for the network to pick up spot imagery of battle scenes around the world from stringers and from other news agencies. And I suppose the dark side of the First Amendment is that the news organizations in this country have to be profitable. You have to be profitable to have a free press. And so operationally, it is cheap to fill a newscast with the quick police scanner sorts of images that the chief referred to, and as Jeff said, it costs him $1 million a year to enterprise the more positive stories. Ted, I would tell you that 3/4 of the viewers are also telling us that television news should put a greater emphasis on positive stories. They're very expensive to gather. It's very easy to pick up the crime beat stuff because there is a network of stringers out there all throughout Washington following probably 500 feet behind the chief's patrol cars as they go out to make these arrests. And news organizations, which are filling more and more hours of television time every week with serious news broadcasts and what I would call infotainment, they're very hungry for pictures to fill up these minutes of airtime.
Mr. Mallory, is it a question of money?
I think it has a lot to do with anything done well will attract an audience, and television finds it very easy to cover these kinds of stories. You put a camera at a crime scene and you have a story. And I think the real challenge...
Easy and cheap.
Easy and cheap. I think the challenge is if you're railing against that kind of a newscast and you're working at a local television station, you have to figure out how to do something that may be more difficult. That may be to cover issues that do not caress the camera easily. To take some issues in your community that television doesn't find very easy to address, and to do those as well as those who decide that they're going to fill up their newscasts does what they're doing.
Before we
fill it up with crime stories.
Yes, go ahead.
Let me just make one point, Ted, and that is I'm a former television news director in my other life, and I think that as we have moved to the ability to broadcast pictures instantaneously from any point in the world, journalists have lost that moment of reflection when the film was in the processor to think about judiciously putting pictures and stories into context. I think in some sense the immediacy of what they have to handle makes it so much more difficult to do the job.
We have with us the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Donna Shalala. I would ask you, Madam Secretary, just to hold on for 1 second. Let us take another look now at a piece by Jeff Greenfield, this one on the subject of crime and violence on television news, a reflection of an old cliche that we use in this business.
The year I was born, there were 44 murders in New York City. 44 murders all year. Last year, there were 1,995. When people say they're more afraid of crime than they used to be, this is one big reason. There's a lot more crime. That's also one big reason why television news covers so much crime. It's a real story. But there's a lot more to this issue than that.
There is an air of tension and fear here in Van Nuys tonight.
This story contains graphic scenes of that shooting.
Erupted in gunfire this afternoon, and when it was over, a store clerk lay dead.
It's been said for years in television newsrooms, if it bleeds, it leads. And while it's hard to prove with statistics that crime and violence dominate local newscasts, viewers clearly believe that's what they're seeing. Last spring, the Times Mirror organization asked whether Americans think TV news shows are bloodier and more violent than they were 10 years ago. 83% said yes. They also said overwhelmingly that they believe television news gives too much attention to violent stories. Media critics say the same thing.
Rarely in Los Angeles, for example, do you find in-depth coverage of anything that does not involve violence or bloodshed or meaningless, mindless car chases.
When you watch these newscasts night after night, you see 3 homicides, 2 rapes, and then, crimes from around the country. The fact is, that sensationalist approach scares the hell out of you. You finally start to wonder, gee, could this happen to me? Is it safe to go outside my door?
And it's not just the public or media critics who flinch at the on-screen carnage. So do some news practitioners.
The way we cover crime on television probably sends the message that there's actually more crime going on than there really is.
And it's very easy to cover. You don't have to invest in really educating reporters. They don't have to know what GAD is or what NAFTA is. They go out there and they shoot the crime scene with the yellow tape around the house.
And it's not just local news. One survey reports that there's twice as much crime coverage on network evening newscasts as there was just 5 years ago. And what does the public think about this coverage?
What I'm picking up on is there's a lot of anger among any number of viewers who say you're just not reflecting my neighborhood, my city, and you're not telling me any solutions. You're not telling me what works.
But if the polls are any judge, the public is of two minds about the coverage. The same public that says TV news has made them more fearful also says TV news is better than it was 5 years ago. So what's the real message of the crime and violence on TV news? Is it presenting a grim but truthful message about crime as a social issue? Is it painting a false, panicky portrait of a scary world? Or is it simply that today's television news shapers know what their forebears knew decades, even centuries ago? The horrible deeds that people do to each other just fascinate us.
Secretary Shalala, old Jeff Greenfield knows what he's doing. He throws questions out there. You want to give us some answers?
Well, I'm not sure I have any answers. I think that every news person here could justify their individual story, but they don't take any responsibility for the repetition of it day after day and the cumulative effect on the public and how they feel about their own safety, or about young blacks and how they feel about how they're portrayed on television. We could actually justify any one of these shows any day, but the cumulative effect, the intensity of it, is what's shaping our society and our attitudes and our fear about violence, and in the end, what we end up doing as public policy. This may be a dumb question, but I'm not sure why we have to see the images in the description of crime. Part of the problem may be we don't have enough text, enough context, which is what we get when we see other kinds of stories.
David Shaw, this is what you do for a living. You cover us doing what we do. You got some thoughts on this?
Well, it does seem to me that, all the recent studies have shown that crime is going down, and yet if you asked anybody on the street, they wouldn't believe it. And I think the reason for that is what the Madam Secretary says, the constant repetition of violent crime on television gives people the sense that crime is inevitable, that it's pervasive, that there's no way to get away from it. And we have people who are moving out of cities because they think that crime is worse than it used to be, when in fact it's not. And it creates kind of a self-perpetuating phenomenon.
Some crime is down, but violent crime is up.
No, violent crime is down, 25%.
Violent crime is also down.
That's down.
Yeah.
According to victim surveys even.
If I could just make a point about Washington, I think most of you would presume that the crime in Washington is much higher than it was this time last year. Absolutely not true. Crime overall, including violent crime, is going down. And that's true in almost every major city in the country. But from watching the television and reading the print media, one does not get that impression.
I think there's
the impression that everything is out of control.
That I think needs to
be injected, which is that we clearly are a very segregated society. And the only images that a lot of people have, a lot of white people certainly have, of black people that of any significance are images they see in the media. And the images that you see in the media, and certainly the images that you see on local newscasts as well as network newscasts, present blacks as disproportionately desperate, depraved, demanding, and victimized. There's a guy out at Northwestern who spent some time looking at some statistics of local and national broadcasts. What he found for national broadcasts was that 50% of the times when blacks are presented, they are presented as either criminals or victims of some sort. And the largest next category are blacks presented as black spokesmen or black experts or black something. So you have this huge image that's put out there of a society which sees blacks either as criminals, victims, or professional blacks.
And Andy Haywood, if I may, 48 Hours, a program which you used to produce, Eye to Eye, a program which you produce right now, as do many of the magazine programs on this network and on NBC, often focus on the issues of crime. Any resonance to the criticism that you hear?
Well, certainly, excuse me, yeah, there's resonance to it, although I think, if anything, the magazines are also guilty of painting white people in a horrible light. If you believe the world that the magazines conjure up a lot of the time, every white person was abused as a child and eventually grew up and murdered somebody as a result or is searching for repressed memories. I mean,
there were no whites in 48 Hours on Crack Street. That was a notoriously decadent piece of work that you did.
I actually wasn't involved in that one.
Well, anyway, the average crack addict is a white male professional living in the suburbs, according to a New York Times survey, which is repeated in the Oakland Tribune. But if you looked at that show, 48 Hours on Crack Street, you would think that the crack epidemic was a black enterprise, the consumers were black, and was all black.
Yeah, actually what we find, even when blacks and whites are reported with the same types of crime, the reporting is different. When blacks are reported having been accused of violent crimes, they are much more likely to be pictured in restraints than whites are who are accused of committing violent crimes. There's a clear difference in images that comes across, and why that is not quite clear. But
there's another key issue in terms of balance as well. And you may talk about that you will show whites portrayed in a bad light, but you'll also have in that piece a white expert. When you see blacks portrayed in a bad light, you don't see a positive image of somebody in the same piece who is also African American.
See, I think that's the key. I would say that what resonates for me is the fact that there are very few blacks on television news except in these roles. I don't think the answer is to shy away from crime, and I don't think the media or reporters are responsible for creating an image of a society that's actually safe and that it only looks dangerous on the news. I don't think that's true.
But you shy away from crime when it comes to whites. 54% of the violent crimes in this country are committed by whites. Well, 60% of the hate crimes are committed by white teenagers.
I think
like a white teenager bombed a Japanese American councilman's home, bombed a synagogue, and tried to bomb the NAACP. They didn't give his name.
I have to respectfully disagree. I think that crimes committed by whites get a lot of attention on television news. If anything, and I think about this, but I think that probably from the point of view of selling a story, a lurid crime, a tabloid crime involving whites is a better sell from the point of view of a cynical television news producer.
So you're saying the fact that 70% of the crimes in this country are committed by whites, that's reflected on television?
What I'm saying is that I don't think that television news exclusively portrays blacks as criminals. I agree that the kind of the superficial coverage in the inner city can become numbingly repetitive, and I think what's needed there is, if anything, better crime coverage. I think the villain
certainly not exclusively, but disproportionately, and no one would argue, I think, that you ought to stop covering crimes. Obviously, crimes are an important story in this society, and obviously crimes that are committed by whites, blacks, Latinos, any group comprise an important story. But I think, as any number of people have said, the problem is that that is not put in the context of a larger picture of people who are too often portrayed in a one-dimensional way.
Let me, if I may, just jump in here for a moment, because we have two of our colleagues who are not here with us and therefore can't jump in as easily. Ann Bishop, you first, please, and then Tom, you.
Well, it's interesting, and I was thinking, of course, of State of Fear, which was the 48 Hours program that just aired, and I think the majority of the people who were portrayed in that were young black people who were preying on the citizens of this community. But one of the things that I wanted to say is it's not all black. There's enough crime for everybody to go around, especially here in South Florida. But one of the things that I wanted to point out was the fact that we have to serve our local community. We have a lot of rules and regulations about covering crime. We don't show bodies that aren't covered. We don't focus on the spot of blood that's on the ground. We try to be very circumspect in what we do on the air, and we just don't break the rules. We aren't tabloid news. We don't want to be, and obviously the public is disenchanted with that. But we do report the crime in this community because the local citizens are very concerned about crime. If you have a number of the ATM crimes that happen between 7 and 9, it's important, or if it's in a particular community, it's important for those people to know that it is dangerous in that community. And we're trying to help them protect themselves and to be able to get through this society as safely as possible. And that has a lot to do with the crime that we report.
Tom Brokaw, I can understand how some of our viewers might be a little bit confused right now. On the one hand, they are hearing that the public at large is disenchanted with crime. On the other hand, I was just watching your program the other day, you and Katie Couric, the Now program, which again, as many of our magazine programs do, focused almost exclusively on crime and violence. Now, if you don't think it sells, why would you do it?
Well, we did that in part because I think that we do have an epidemic of violence in this country, and a lot of it has to do with the phenomenon of new kinds of violence. Not too far from where I'm sitting right now in south central Los Angeles, they've had a record number of homicides already this year. There are still 3 weeks to go. We've had the terrible tragedy in the black working class communities of families living paralyzed by fear because of drive-by shootings. The new crusade of Jesse Jackson is black on black violence. He was quoted in Chicago as saying the other day he's embarrassed at this point in his life that when he hears steps behind him on a city street and he looks around, he's relieved when it's a white person. We have to deal with that phenomenon as well that is going on in many of these communities. Now, I've spent a lot of time on this issue. The fact of the matter is that those are the people that I'm most concerned about, are those black middle class and working class families who are identified by whatever else is going on. In that program that we did the other night, Ted, we worked very hard on context and on solution, and try to do that in a way that people could have a perspective about what was going on. And I think that's the obligation, and I believe that's being fulfilled by the networks. I do worry a lot about what's going on at the local television stations.
Jeff Greenfield, just a quick thought from you, and then we're going to close this segment out and move on.
I want to be a heretic. I don't think we cover crime nearly enough. It's just that we don't cover it well. You get a great reporter like Jimmy Breslin who goes into a neighborhood, and by the time he's finished reporting on it, it's a redemptive piece. You have a sense of the suffering, of the pain, particularly on those families that have less and have lost their breadwinner. And I think the idea that we ought to minimize that is wrong. What we ought to do is stop the coverage of body bags and blood, go into those neighborhoods, probably with someone like Reverend Butts, and let him take us and let him show us the real scar in his community as well as other communities, because that way you get a sense of the humanity that's at stake in this issue and not just statistics and bullets.
Reverend Butts, since your name has been invoked.
Well, I might not be Reverend Butts, but I think a major problem with TV news is the absence of people who look like me.
That's right.
Who write it, who assign, who report it, who are there.
Make the
For example, you had a shot of the Central Park rape, the name, no pictures, not talking about the merits of the case or anything, but Tawana Brawley, picture was on the television, name, just a completely different style of coverage altogether. I called a local affiliate in New York and said, who is your news director? Is he or she black? No. Did you talk to anybody black? No. You know, just nobody. It's an absence. My friend here said he was a former news director. I would love to hear a lot of black folks say that. If we are just not there. So you want to talk about how do we achieve the balance? How do we get more creativity? How do we bring new life into news? Bring some people who have never been there in. That's the thing that you never, ever do.
All right, we'll pick up on that again a little bit later. We're going to take a break. We'll be back in a moment.
It kills the germs that cause bad breath. It fights plaque. It battles the gum infection, gingivitis. It's Listerine antiseptic. It's there to protect you.
Why put up with glasses that are too heavy? LensCrafters exclusive featherweight lenses are lighter, slimmer, and oh so comfortable.
I never knew glasses could be this comfortable.
LensCrafters exclusive featherweight lenses. Lighter weight for greater comfort in about an hour.
It's the Sears early opening sale. Tomorrow, Saturday, 8 to 10 a.m. You decide what's on sale with Sears Bucks. Check Friday's paper for your Sears Bucks. Then get to Sears early opening sale this Saturday and make your own sale. Save from $2 to $100 on all regular and sale priced items. Every Craftsman tool, every Kenmore appliance, every Die-Hard battery. Every item in every department is on sale with Sears Bucks. Tomorrow, Saturday, from 8 to 10 a.m. Only at Sears, your home for the holidays.
If you're looking for the right gifts but have no idea where to find them, take your search to Best Buy, because no matter who you're shopping for, no matter what your budget...
This ABC News special, Viewpoint, crime, violence, and TV news continues. Once again, Ted Koppel.
If you are just joining us, this is another one of our periodic Viewpoint programs in which we allow our critics to come in and have at us and try as best we can to respond to some of the issues that we raise. At the beginning of this program, we talked about some of the impact that the new technology has on the kind of coverage that we present to the American public, but indeed the nature of that technology sometimes actually defines what is news. Here once again, Jeff Greenfield.
It was television's first magic word, live. You could see a baseball game or a political convention or a comedy right as it was happening. On television news, live is still a magic word. With portable satellites and helicopters and microwave relays, we can go live just about anywhere, anytime. But should we?
A lone gunman waited till the doors on the train closed, and then he pulled a 9mm semi-automatic and opened fire.
No one denies that this is news. The story of a gunman firing on passengers in a rush-hour commuter train will get massive coverage as soon as possible. But what about this?
At one point, the suspect fired a shotgun.
An airborne traffic helicopter spots a car chase. Police in pursuit of somebody. Local TV stations interrupt regular programming to follow the chase, mile after mile, until the end. Why?
How much is that story really worth? But because television has the technological capacity to go live, and because you can get these dramatic sort of bang-bang pictures, news executives think it's riveting television. But I think it's not really very important.
For now, we're live.
Well, thanks for that live update. Reporting live.
Live in Summit.
What is important, say some news consultants, is that the news look urgent, happening, now. So night after night, reporters are sent out to report back, live, from a place where nothing is happening.
Live tonight. We have people standing in front of empty buildings or walls in the dark of night just so they can say, we did a live shot. There's nothing immediate about any of that.
Moreover, when you commit to live coverage, you lose, by definition, editorial control. Facts can go on the air unchecked, as in 1981, during coverage of the Reagan shooting, when ABC News erroneously reported the death of Press Secretary James Brady, then had to retract it.
Let's get it nailed down, somebody. Let's find out.
But live coverage isn't the only pitfall. What about sensational pictures whose news value is questionable? Earlier this year, the Spanish-language Telemundo news network captured this footage of a husband killing his wife. The footage was run on many local stations and on NBC's nightly news.
As I remember at the time, it was justified because it was supposed to be representative of domestic violence. Now, I mean, are you going to tell me that we have to show something like this to be able for the nation to understand the ramifications of domestic violence? I think that's just a purely just a cheap rationale for showing pictures that shouldn't be shown.
Which brings us to a striking tendency on network news, not local, network, to feature all sorts of sensational stories on allegedly noble grounds. Does the Amy Fisher, Joey Buttafuoco story throw important light on modern-day suburban America? Does the Woody Allen-Mia Farrow fight throw important light on child custody law? Does the Lorena Bobbitt story really tell us something significant about spousal abuse? Or is it just possible that the respectable network media are as eager as their supposedly less high-minded counterparts to feed the public the junk food we think it wants?
And let me turn immediately to my friend and colleague Dick Wald, Executive Vice President of ABC News. And I'd like you to address, if you would, Dick, the degree to which, merely because we can, we do.
Well,
I think that we can do some things, and we like to show them off. From the earliest days when Murrow was able to show you both coasts live at the same time, and it was a big thing. Live television has an attractive power that remains to this day, even though we use a lot of it. I think that we have grown sophisticated enough to be able to deal with live television, and were, heaven forfend, to go back to 1981, a president to be shot, I think we would cover it live if we could, if we were there. People want to know. That's what we do. That's what our process is. And we are able, and we have the kind of people who can do it. We do make mistakes. You see the process as it happens, and we correct it as we go along.
Look, as a newsman of many, many years standing, can you tell me what the sense is of doing something live if you could wait 10 minutes and actually get a little bit of editorial perspective?
It depends on what the something is. Why would you wait 10 minutes to tell people the president's been shot?
Well, you certainly wouldn't in that particular instance, but merely because an event happens and you have a camera there that's capable of covering it live quite clearly, whether it's your anchorman back in the studio or your reporter on the scene, they need a few minutes to gather information. Why put them on the air right away?
But we don't.
Well, yes, we do.
If something, we don't. We covered once. We covered a dying tree live. I thought that was a fascinating moment in American television. We cover strange things live from time to time, but I don't think that we have strayed in the last 10 years, maybe.
Let me say a word, Waco. Anybody here who covered Waco live? Bernie, CNN?
Yes, we did.
You feel comfortable doing something like that? Not live. When I say comfortable, I'm asking you as the guy who's out front, who's sitting behind the desk and has to report on what's going on. In that particular instance, we had a situation where sometimes the cameras were, what, 2 miles away? Mm-hmm. It was impossible to know what was going on. All one could do, perhaps, is speculate on what was going on back there, and yet you went live, we went live, everybody went live at different
I think there's
times.
certain things you can do in the role of being a responsible journalist and still convey accurately as best you can based on your cameras and what